On a cold June night in 1962, 3 inmates broke out of the most secure prison in American history. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanished into the black waters of San Francisco Bay, and were never seen again. The FBI declared them dead, but evidence across 6 decades hints at a very different ending. Did the men who escaped Alcatraz actually survive? Tonight, we uncover the truth hiding behind the rock's greatest mystery. The unbreakable prison and the men who chose to break it, for 500-plus characters. Long before the world wondered whether 3 escapees survived the unforgiving currents of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was already feared as the one place where freedom simply didn't exist. It wasn't a prison in the normal sense. It was a concrete island designed to crush hope, a fortress built with one purpose. No one escapes the rock. The U.S. government didn't create Alcatraz out of ambition, it created it out of fear. The early 1930s were a law enforcement nightmare. America had become a playground for armed bank robbers, kidnappers, mob bosses, and escape artists who embarrassed prisons nationwide. Criminals like John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, the Barker Karpus Gang, and dozens more became celebrities, slipping through police hands like smoke. The federal system was being mocked. So Washington made a decision. Build a place so unforgiving, so isolated, so terrifying that even the boldest criminal would tremble at the thought of going there. A place where you couldn't corrupt guards, you couldn't organize gangs, you couldn't communicate with the outside world, you couldn't hide, you couldn't run, and you certainly couldn't escape. They needed a facility that combined iron, concrete, cold water, and psychological warfare. They needed an island with natural defenses that no man could overcome. They needed Alcatraz. The perfect location for a nightmare. Alcatraz Island sits in the heart of San Francisco Bay, visible from the city, yet impossibly distant. The wind cuts through the air like blades. Fog rolls across the bay with eerie silence. The waters churn violently even on calm days. Temperatures in June, the month of the escape, average around 53 degrees Fahrenheit 11 degrees Celsius in the water. Cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. The currents rip outward toward the Pacific Ocean, strong enough to pull experienced swimmers under. The government didn't just build a prison. It built a natural trap. To prisoners arriving on the island, the message was clear. You can see freedom, but you will never touch it. That psychological torment was part of the punishment. The prisoners who were too dangerous for any other prison. Alcatraz wasn't meant for petty criminals. It was for the problem inmates, the manipulators, the escape artists, the violent troublemakers who couldn't be controlled anywhere else. When a man was sent to Alcatraz, it wasn't because he committed a crime. It was because he caused chaos inside other prisons. Alcatraz was the end of the line. That's why it housed men who murdered guards, men who bribed entire prison staffs, men who escaped repeatedly, mob bosses who ran criminal empires from behind bars, gang leaders who organized riots, inmates too dangerous, too smart, or too bold. And among these men were 3 names that history would never forget. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin. They didn't enter Alcatraz as legends, but they would leave as one. Frank Morris, the quiet, dangerous genius. Frank Lee Morris wasn't a bully. He wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't even particularly violent. He was something much more dangerous in a maximum security environment. He was brilliant. Born to a troubled family and shuffled through orphanages, Morris learned early how to survive alone, with intelligence, discipline, and an uncanny ability to read systems. He escaped from multiple prisons across the country. He studied patterns with the focus of a mathematician. He found weak points others overlooked. He used tools no one noticed. Psychologists who interviewed him described him as highly intelligent, methodical, calculating, and unusually observant. Prison officials saw him differently. A high-risk escape artist with extreme problem-solving ability. When Morris was caught after his last escape attempt, federal officials decided enough was enough. He wasn't going to a normal prison. He was going to Alcatraz, the one place a man like him supposedly couldn't beat. But they underestimated him. The Anglin brothers, the poor farm boys who refused to break. Clarence and John Anglin came from a family of 13 children, raised in poverty across Georgia and Florida. The brothers were inseparable, hardworking, loyal, and physically tough from growing up in the fields. But when they turned to crime, something unexpected happened. They developed a talent for escape. The Anglin brothers weren't masterminds like Morris, but they were highly skilled with their hands, expert at crafting tools, disciplined, calm under pressure, and strong swimmers, a detail that would later matter more than anyone knew. Before Alcatraz, they escaped from the Atlanta penitentiary and multiple county jails. When caught again, they too were sent to the Rock. Not because they were violent. Not because they were dangerous in the traditional sense. But because they were the kind of prisoners who didn't stay locked up. And once all three men, Morris, Clarence Anglin and John Anglin, ended up in adjacent cells on the same tier, history began moving toward its most legendary moment. The three men who would change Alcatraz forever. When Morris arrived, he saw opportunities. When the Anglin brothers arrived, they saw the same cracks. Together they formed a silent alliance. No dramatic conversations. No whispered scheming. No notes passed. Just three men who recognized talent in one another, and began constructing what would become the most sophisticated escape plan in American history. The Rock was designed to break men. But these three? They weren't like the others. And soon Alcatraz, the one prison no one was meant to escape, was about to be tested in a way the government never expected. A prison built for legends meets its match. The men who would attempt the impossible didn't have fame, wealth, or power. What they had was far more dangerous. Time, intelligence, desperation, and absolute focus. Their escape wouldn't rely on luck. It would rely on craftsmanship, discipline, and a plan so bold that the world still can't agree whether it succeeded. Life on the Rock. The routine that created escapists for 500-plus characters. Before Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers ever carved into their cell walls. Before the dummy heads, the raincoat raft, or the climb through the ventilation shaft. Alcatraz itself was shaping them. In a prison engineered to break men, these three discovered something unexpected. Alcatraz didn't break them. It sharpened them. To understand how the escape became possible, you must first understand what daily life on the Rock did to the human mind, how it turned frustration into precision, silence into strategy, and monotony into mastery. Because on Alcatraz, survival required more than strength. It required adaptability, observation, patience. The very conditions meant to crush hope are the same conditions that ultimately fueled the greatest escape attempt in U.S. history. The cell, a box with no comfort, no privacy, no hope. The standard Alcatraz cell measured just 5 feet wide, 9 feet long, and 7 feet high. A space so small that when you stretched your arms out, your fingertips nearly brushed the walls. Inside each prisoner had one steel cot bolted to the concrete, one thin mattress, one metal desk, one small shelf, a sink with cold water only, a toilet with zero privacy, a single dim light bulb, a heavy door of rusted steel bars. This was not living. This was confinement in its purest form. And yet, the men who escaped used these very constraints to their advantage. The tiny sink? It hid the weak ventilation opening. The dim light? It masked nighttime work. The shelf? It stored stolen materials that guards didn't notice. Inside their claustrophobic concrete box, Morris and the Anglins began planning the impossible, in silence. The rule that broke men, and birthed ingenuity. Alcatraz enforced a rule no other federal prison embraced. Almost total silence. No talking in the cell block. No whispering at work. No small talk in the corridors. No calling between tiers. The silence wasn't a mere regulation, it was a psychological weapon. A way to crush camaraderie, communication, and resistance. Former inmates recalled the silence as suffocating. You could hear a man breathe from 3 cells away. I forgot the sound of my own voice. The silence drove stronger men insane. But silence didn't drive Morris insane. It drove him inward. It sharpened his observational skills. It taught him how to study the guards, the schedule, the sounds of the building, the metal pipes that rattled, the ventilation whine, the echo of every footstep. The Anglin brothers, quiet by nature, thrived under the rule. While others mentally cracked, these three adapted. Silence didn't crush them. It gave them concentration. The routine, a military machine that never changed. Every day unfolded the same. 6:30 a.m. wake up. The light clicked on. Inmates had seconds to stand at attention. 6:55 a.m., breakfast march. Single file, silent, supervised by armed guards posted on upper tiers. The mess hall was so feared that a sign still visible today reads, "No talking during meals." Forks and knives were counted before and after every meal. This mattered, because years later, a missing spoon would become part of the escape. 7:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., work detail. Most inmates worked jobs such as laundry, kitchen prep, tailoring, gardening, machinery repair, metal shop. Work was not a privilege, it was mandatory. Morris worked in the brush shop. The Anglins worked in the sewing room. These workshops were crucial. They gave the men access to tools, materials, and, most important, trash that guards rarely inspected closely. The workshops would become the birthplace of escape equipment. 5:30 p.m., dinner. Same silence. Same routine. 6:30 p.m., lockdown. Cell doors slammed. Lights dimmed. The prison fell into quiet. Except, not all prisoners slept. This was when Morris and the Anglins went to work. The noise that saved them, the Alcatraz prison band. There is a wildly ironic fact about the escape. A prison orchestra made it possible. Alcatraz allowed inmates to join a marching band that practiced at night. The band played loudly, brass, drums, woodwinds, filling the cell house with echoes that masked small noises. And behind their sinks, Morris and the Anglins weren't sleeping. They were scraping, digging, chiseling, softening the concrete. Each chip of the wall was timed to the rhythm of a drumbeat. Each scrape matched a saxophone note. This wasn't luck. This was discipline. The prison itself provided the cover they needed. It was a mistake Alcatraz guards would regret forever. The unintended weakness, Alcatraz was rotting. The prison was built in the early 20th century, and by the 1960s, seawater and decades of damp coastal fog had eaten away at its interior. The concrete behind the ventilation grates was softer than anyone realized. In some places it crumbled like chalk. The Anglins discovered they could dig with spoons, forks, metal files, sandpaper made from shoe polish, a drill built from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor. When they began, each hole was the size of a postage stamp. After months of scraping, they were large enough for a grown man to crawl through. Behind those holes was something Alcatraz officials never imagined an inmate would access. A utility corridor, a secret highway through the cell block. Dark, narrow, lined with pipes, unmonitored. The moment they stepped inside that shaft, they had already escaped their cells. The hardest part. The prison's biggest irony, the walls didn't keep them in, they hid them. Every night, Morris and the Anglins crawled through their expanding holes and entered the corridor. Guards walking the tiers saw nothing unusual. The men appeared to be sleeping. Dummy heads lay on their pillows. Blankets were shaped like bodies. Cells looked perfectly normal from outside. But inside the walls? The escape team moved freely. They stole paint, tools, wire, glue, stolen rubber, fabric, scrap wood. They built a raft, life vests, waterproof bags, a platform to climb to the roof. And they stored everything above the cell block in a hidden attic space the guards never inspected. The rock, the prison designed to monitor every inch of inmate behavior, had blind spots. And Frank Morris found every one. The inmates who wanted in, and the one man who said no. Here's a lesser-known truth. At least one more inmate was part of the plan. His name was Alan West. West helped dig the escape holes, helped gather materials, and helped with the raft construction. But as the escape date neared, West's hole was still too small to crawl through. And on June 11, 1962, the night of the escape, he couldn't get out. He screamed. He begged. He tried to dig faster. He panicked. But Morris and the brothers made a cold, calculated choice. If they waited for West, they risked everything. So they left him behind. West later gave his version to the authorities, fueling debates for decades about whether the other three survived. But here's the twist. Some researchers believe West lied to protect the escapees. His story didn't always match the evidence. The atmosphere before the escape, tension you could feel. Guards later admitted something felt unusual in the final weeks before the escape. The men seemed calm. Too calm. Focused. Almost relaxed. Morris, usually alert and guarded, appeared serene. The Anglin brothers, normally anxious, seemed at peace. Something was coming. Something big. And on the night of June 11, 1962, all the years of psychological torture, rigid structure, and hopeless routines led to one moment. The moment three men slipped out of their cells. And into history. The Rock never expected these men. Alcatraz's greatest weakness wasn't its structure. It wasn't the cold water. It wasn't the guards or the keys or the gun towers. It was this. They underestimated the human mind. The same rules designed to crush hope. The silence, the routine, the confinement. Gave Morris and the Anglins the focus needed to engineer the impossible. And now, they were ready. The night of the escape, How Three Men Beat the Rock, 500+ characters, June 11, 1962. A calm night, unusually quiet, unusually fogless, unusually still. Nothing about that night seemed suspicious, and that was the first mistake the guards made. For 6 months, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had chiseled, drilled, painted, sculpted, and engineered their way to this moment. Every move had been rehearsed. Every sound memorized. Every guard routine studied. Every detail accounted for. Now, as the prison settled into darkness, the most heavily guarded prison in American history was about to be penetrated from the inside. Not by force. Not by violence. But by patience, genius, and will. The final check. Dummy heads so real they fooled every guard. At 9:30 p.m. the final count passed. Guards walked row by row, tier by tier, each guard shining a flashlight through the bars. What they saw. Morris sleeping peacefully. Clarence Anglin resting on his pillow. John Anglin turned to the wall, blanket pulled up. Nothing looked strange. What they didn't see. The men weren't in their beds. The men weren't even in their cells. The men were already halfway through their plan. And the faces on the pillows? They weren't faces at all. Each one was a dummy head made from soap, toilet paper, concrete dust, paint, and real hair stolen from the barbershop. The craftsmanship was astonishing. Under a dim flashlight beam, the heads looked exactly like sleeping inmates. Even the shadows cast across the cheekbones mimicked real human skin texture. Guards walked on. The deception had worked. The exit, a hole just wide enough for a desperate man. Behind their sinks, each prisoner had carved an opening approximately 6 by 8 inches. Too small for most men. But just big enough for 3 underfed inmates who had spent months losing weight on purpose. They crawled through one by one, entering the dark, dusty utility corridor behind their cells, the invisible spine of cell block B. For the guards outside, everything looked calm. For the men inside the walls, adrenaline surged. The utility corridor, the prison's secret highway. The maintenance shaft was never meant to be accessible from the cells, a detail the escape team exploited brilliantly. In this hidden space they stored stolen materials, assembled tools, built the raft, hid their equipment, climbed pipes to the roof, all without a single guard knowing. On the night of the escape they strapped makeshift flotation vests under their clothes, secured the stolen raincoat raft, grabbed wooden paddles, packed personal items in waterproof bags. Then they began climbing. The climb to the top of Alcatraz. The escape route required ascending 3 stories of vertical plumbing pipes leading into an unguarded space above the cell house. The shaft was dark, narrow, slick with moisture, smelling of rust and mildew. Clarence Anglin went first. John followed. Then Morse, who had spent years training his mind for moments like this, climbed last. They moved in silence, careful not to disturb loose pipes or metal. At the top, they kicked through a vent panel that had been weakened during previous nights. It bent outward, creating a hole large enough to crawl onto the roof. Cold wind blasted them. The rock wasn't giving up easily. The roof, exposed, visible, and deadly. The rooftop was the most dangerous part of the escape. A single loud noise could alert guards. A misstep could mean a fatal fall. One wandering flashlight beam could end everything. They stayed low, crawling across the roof, gripping the edges with frozen hands. They reached the northeast corner, a blind spot to the watchtowers. This wasn't luck, it was calculated. Morris had studied the guard rotations and lighting angles for months. Here they prepared to descend the 50-foot exterior wall. Using a length of rope and stolen electrical cords tied together, they slid down carefully to the ground. They had entered the forbidden area beyond the cell house. Now they had to reach the water. The shoreline, the most dangerous step. The trio scrambled across uneven terrain until they reached a small overhang on the northeast shore. Here the raft was stored under driftwood and rocks, hidden in plain sight. The raincoat raft was a masterpiece. 50+ stolen raincoats, sealed with heat from plumbing pipes, glued using homemade adhesive, inflated using a stolen concertina blower, a kind of accordion. This wasn't desperation. This was engineering. At around 11:30 p.m., they carried the raft into the churning, freezing water. The tide was strong. The wind was punishing. The fog was thickening. The waves slammed like fists. The guards in the watchtowers saw nothing. From this moment on, the men were gone. The FBI's uncomfortable findings. At 7:15 a.m. the next morning, guards discovered the dummy heads. Panic erupted instantly. The search began. The vent holes were found. The corridor was inspected. The roof was examined. The shoreline revealed footprints. Oars were found. A homemade life vest was discovered. But no bodies. No clothing. No raft. And the most damning piece? A waterproof bag washed up, containing photographs of the Anglin family sealed perfectly dry. If the men had drowned, the bag would have sunk. Why didn't it? The official word versus the unofficial truth. Officially, the FBI declared, they drowned. Case closed. Except, they didn't close the case. The file stayed open for 17 years. New evidence emerged every decade. Family members received mysterious Christmas cards. Newspaper clippings were mailed anonymously. A photograph surfaced in Brazil. Agents disagreed internally. Some believed the men were dead. Others believed they made it. The evidence was complicated. 3 men vanished. What happened next was even stranger. Asterisk asterisk. At 11:30 p.m. on June 11, 1962, 3 men left Alcatraz in a rubber raft. After that, no one knows. No bodies were found. No clothing washed up. No remains. No medical records. No arrests. Just a trail of evidence, scattered, contradictory, haunting. Did they drown? Did they reach Angel Island? Did they flee to South America? Did they live quiet lives under new identities?